All right, good morning. We have a lot going on in this sermon. It's going to be, I'm going to try to pull it to 45 minutes or so if I can. Maybe do it next week a little bit more on this. I can see I was not going to be able to finish it in one sermon. Before we begin, I'd like to show you guys how and why we teach practical Christianity, God's law, and how it applies to us and how we should apply it in our lives. So the other day, I had a buddy of mine had his truck get stuck in a ditch. I brought a truck up with me to show you. So, well, this one's a Chevy. I brought a Ford. Okay, even step side, it's not really my style. But anyway, pickup truck was in a ditch, but it wasn't in a ditch like you'd think, you know. It was in a ditch like this. And I walked up and I saw the tailgate staring up at the sky, and I was like, oh boy, this is not a run-of-the-mill recovery. And anyway, it was a much larger truck than I have, so this one's more appropriate. But the reason I used the Chevy is because if it had been a Ford, it would have been able to get itself out. But it was up like this, and Reese hitch was staring up in the air, so we got it down someplace flat, and we got the guy out like this. You know, winched it on out. With the assistance of a school bus, which I happen to own. So we got that out, but it was not on the schedule for me to go and recover well, in this case, it was a Dodge pickup truck. So I thought, well, I've got other stuff to do today. I've got to get to the church and finish this enormous sermon I'm writing. This was Saturday. But then I remembered, well, now it's the Pharisees and Sadducees that would have put church in front of what the Bible said, right? Well, I can't be doing that, even though you would think that the writing a sermon for the nation's kingdom believers would supersede that of helping a buddy get his truck out of the ditch. But I don't think it goes that way. So I remembered what I teach, and I remember what I read, and I remember what I teach you guys. So Deuteronomy 22:4 says, "Thou shalt not see thy brother's ass or his ox or ram fall down by the way, and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt surely help him to lift them up again." Right? Now, isn't that what we read? That's what I remembered, and I said, well, you know what? God made a day stand still for Joshua. I'll have plenty of time to help my brother's ram out of the ditch and finish a kingdom sermon, which I did. And I remembered that the New Testament speaks of something as well, so Paul must have understood this. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 9 I read, "For God has not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Wherefore, comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also ye do. And we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you, and who are among you in the Lord, and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love, for their work's sake, and be at peace among yourselves. Now we exhort, brethren, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient to all men. See that none render evil for evil unto any man, but ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and to all men." Now there's why we read this Bible. That's why I preach both the law and the New Testament, to give us direction on what it is we're supposed to be doing. So the Old Testament instructs us. Paul reinforces that. Obviously, you'll see some love your neighbor as yourself here. And then, of course, Israelites that know better are then to go out and lead by example, right? That's the whole thing. So that was just a normal day in the life of Pastor Reed. Some off-road recovery and a little bit of kingdom sermons, all in one day. During the broadcast this morning, you might hear some squeaking. We have some bats in the hiding out in the rafters over there, actually right behind our clock. So after I found that, I thought it was about time we took care of them. And I hope they don't get out because I don't want to have to preach on the wing. Now, Another thing that's come up also is on YouTube and a lot of people on Facebook and such and so, which I follow questions and comments on those as well. So people are trying to say the baptisms that we do or we have done or the baptisms that we believe in doing as Christians are a Roman Catholic tradition or a Roman Catholic sacrament, and especially when it comes to infant baptism. So a lot of people are having a problem with that. I would expect they didn't listen to the whole sermon. So they'll start it, find something to disagree with, cut it off, and then they've got all these questions. And I'm always like, well, if you finish it, I gave a whole hour sermon on that. If you finish that, you'll probably be a little more informed and have less questions. So nothing wrong with questions, but I would expect one to do their homework first. So anyway, we're going to touch on that real quick. I've got Harper's Bible Dictionary from 1956. Under baptism, I read... baptism was a rite characteristic of John the Baptist's ministry. Let's see. Just prior to the Christian era, proselytes from the Gentiles qualified for membership in Israel by baptism. John the Baptist took this ceremony and adapted it as purification for the reign of the Messiah. By means of this rite, the people were consecrated to receive salvation. Consecrated to receive salvation. So we're not about to have baptism, the sacrament, turn on one's salvation or have it be predicated or contingent on your salvation. We don't teach that. They actually go hand in hand. As a believer, you get baptized, right? So it's not one or the other. It's not. I don't know why it has to be that way, but a lot of people stay with the extremes. And then, of course, they go over the immersion and stuff like that. But if you really want to get into what it is, you'll have to go to sacrament. So you go to sacrament to follow up on that. Sacrament, religious ceremonies in which the visible means are used in the belief that a special divine grace is or may be thereby conveyed to the subject. The Bible does not use the term, though the meaning is biblical. In the most simple sense of sacrament, one thing is regarded as a sign of another, and what is signified is then conveyed to the participant. Okay, so that's baptism. Protestants, they have generally followed the New Testament, recognizing only two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, which we know that is communion. It being held that these were the only two instituted or commanded by Christ. Okay, and there's several other sacraments that the Roman Catholics get into in other churches. The mode of baptism has long been in dispute, but there is rarely any dispute as to its sacramental significance. Water and its purifying power are treated as a sign of the Holy Spirit and his cleansing and transforming influence. Okay? Water baptism is immersion by water in water. Nevertheless, water is the visible sign of the invisible, and this invisible gives the rite its significance as a sign of a person's entry into the church as into the community of the redeemed. Okay, so that's the function of baptism. That's all. Entry into the church. Now we know who the true church is. We know who they identify as, so we're not going to go into that. Infant baptism probably began with the early apostolic custom of baptizing entire families, Acts 16. Though in the course of time, with the growth of sacraments in the church, the baptism of infants was held to be necessary to assure their salvation. Now that's held to be necessary to assure salvation. So this is a view of some church or the other, right? That's not our view. Just so you know. Now, just because the Roman Catholics do things doesn't mean they have cornered the market on baptism or infant baptism, or that they've trademarked or patented one thing over the other. There are several things in the Roman Catholic Church that we do not do here. Praying to Mary would be one, obviously. We don't use rosaries. They've got that weird thing about being in limbo and the indulgences. You guys ever seen the indulgences? That'll get somebody out. You can buy somebody out of hell. I've seen one. They're framed. And on there is a little golden ticket. And it looks exactly like the Willy Wonka golden ticket. It really does. And it's a real thing. I mean, we don't do that because we know it's not biblical. But there are some things that the Roman Catholics, maybe the Lutherans, other Protestant churches, denominations, what have you, do that may overlap with our practices here, but that doesn't mean that we're following in their footsteps. Okay, so let's just get that straight. And that'll be enough of that. So last week, in Romans. We were in Romans 11. We are in Romans 11:11, so we're going to start in verse 11, and we're going to read down to verse 25. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather, through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, insomuch that I am also apostle of the Gentiles. I am magnifying mine office, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches are broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith, by not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God, on them which fall severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if thou were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Now you guys understood all of that in one go, right? Easy to follow language, easy to follow symbolism here, and of course Paul and I and you guys are all on the right page. Well, if you're a little confused, that's fine, because most people are. There's quite a lot going on here. So we've got Gentiles, we've got lumps, emulation, olive trees, roots, branches, life, death, flesh, unbelief, faith, and holiness. So these verses get taught in error by most teachers in the modern church. Instead of paraphrasing the doctrines of the modern clergy, I will instead read to you from a book, and I brought this up a couple weeks ago, this Romance on Romans by N.W. Hutchings. Okay, so what this guy's going to say about what we just read is this. So he's saying, we quoted these 13 verses, which he just read what we read, at one time in order to present the composite picture of Israel's fall and restoration in view of what it means to the Gentiles. Paul asked the question in verse 11, did God cast Israel aside and allow the house of Israel to fall down for the punishment of Israel and no other purpose? He answers the question with a most emphatic God forbid. They fell as a nation for two reasons: that God's salvation might freely pass to the Gentiles, and through God's blessing upon Gentiles, Israel in the end of the age might be provoked to jealousy. So this is what we were talking about last time, where he's saying that us Gentiles, to whom God had no other choice but to pass on his gospel to after his people, the Jewish people, rejected him, we need to be such good Christians that in the end we provoke the true Israel of God, the Jewish people, and convince them to be Christians. And then he's going to try and back it up with the fifth book of the law, Deuteronomy. But under the law, the only way for a blessing of God to be imparted to a Gentile was for the Gentile to become a Jewish proselyte. Even then, the proselytes had to travel 3 times a year to Jerusalem, and they were not allowed in the main temple. But with the setting aside of Israel and the destruction of the temple, a Gentile can call upon the name of the Lord anywhere in the world and be saved. The body of a Christian is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and he is assured of an inheritance with Jesus Christ in heavenly places. The Christian can go directly to God, crying, Father, making his request known as a son seeks favors from his natural father. Okay? Now he goes here. In verse 15, for if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Okay, now this is what he says. In verse 15, Paul compares the casting off of national Israel in 70 AD. Now wait a second. I did not read any dates of 70 AD in this verse 15, but apparently that's what this is talking about, this casting off. So obviously this Noah guy is ignorant of prophecies found elsewhere in the Bible. I would name Hosea right off the bat. The people that were cast off were whom? Israel and Judah, right? He's saying this all happened in 70 AD. To the death of a man, but he points out that there would be resurrection, and we would see that come to pass. Okay, and the resurrection of the nation is a sign of the resurrection of Israel's dead who died in faith and would soon follow. All right. And then he's talking about, in verse 17, Paul begins an explanation concerning the position of Israel in relation to the Gentiles during the dispensation of grace as channels of God's blessings. Israel is represented by the bramble bush, the vine, the fig tree, the olive tree. The bramble bush signifies apostate Israel. The vine signifies the mission of Israel to bring redemption to the Gentiles. The vine produces the wine, which is symbolic of the redeeming and cleansing blood of Christ. And the fig tree is representative of national Israel producing good fruit for the nations. The olive tree, from which was produced the oil for lamps and oil for anointing, represents spiritual Israel, giving forth light to a darkened world. And then he's going to go and say pecan trees, limb is pruned to cut off. So he's talking about to make a tree healthy, you have to prune off the dead branches, right? Because he's getting into this. This is what occurred in 70 AD. The spiritually dead were cut off or pruned from the olive tree, but those Jews which had been born of the Spirit at Pentecost and thereafter were now left. Now remember, we're not talking about national Israel, but spiritual Israel. So this is how he's going to fix the confusion for us. And then he's going to go and talk about how you graft in pecan trees and how he lived in Oklahoma and how he knows all about grafting. And it's pecan tree here, pecan tree that. And then he goes back to the olive tree. He said it would be a miracle to graft a wild olive branch into an orchard olive tree. And this is exactly what it took to graft the church into the tree of blessings of spiritual Israel, the miracle of the spiritual new birth. One thing he's missing the whole time is that you cannot graft different species of trees together. Now that's elementary botany, a little bit of organic chemistry perhaps. If you take OChem, you'll know. But he doesn't get it wrong. He says, well, pecan trees here and pecan trees there. Right, same species. Then he's like, olive tree there. Right, same species. But you're not going to get the pecans in with the olives. It's impossible. Scientifically impossible. It doesn't make human sense. When Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, God's olive tree was dying, and he talks to Nicodemus. And the Gentiles, born again of the Spirit, and as being as wild olive trees, were grafted into the tree where the old branches were trimmed. He missed a part on the root being holy. Who's the holy root of Jesse? Christ. Okay. Blood relatives would graft in other blood relatives. This is what he's missed. It's very easy. Anyway, he's going to patch it up with this spiritual Israel. A remnant of Israel was born again through faith in Jesus Christ. All others, being dead, were pruned. The Gentiles, born again of the Spirit, and as being as a wild olive tree, were grafted into the tree where the old branches were trimmed. Remember, this does not mean that the church has become Israel or that Israel has become the church. This illustration is just another way to demonstrate that during this age of sovereign grace, there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. You see, he's gotten it all wrong. And what's crazy is he's going to say a few things. Israel stands on the covenants and the promises, the law, the oracles of God, but we Gentiles stand only on faith in Jesus according to God's grace. In faith in Jesus, Christ departs from the Gentiles, then our position is even more precarious than Israel's was after the crucifixion of Christ. Keep in mind that the apostle was not speaking of Christians as individuals, but the entire Gentile body as being kept open to channels of God's grace by true believers. All right. We do not interpret the fullness of the Gentiles to mean the church for the following reasons. And he's going to give a list on why what I teach is wrong and what he teaches is right. The church is composed of both Jew and Gentile, and within the church there is neither Jew, Gentile, male, or female. He's quoting Galatians 3:28. According to the text of the Scripture, the blindness of Israel ends with the fullness of the Gentiles, and there is no indication in Scripture that Israel will awaken to the truth of Jesus Christ as the Messiah until the rapture. Their national blindness is removed at the time of Jacob's trouble, which is the latter half of the tribulation. Now that's all future. Jacob's people are not in trouble now. According to Romans 11:23 and 24, grafting off is preceded by a cutting off of the Gentiles. And this subject leads into the discussion about the fullness of the Gentiles. Therefore, it would seem evident that the fullness of the Gentiles refers to the cutting off of Gentile nations, or as Daniel describes from his vision, the destruction of the last Gentile empire by the second coming of Christ. Gentile empires, and he goes on and on and on about the ancient heathen empires of Babylon. I don't know if he did his research further back than that, maybe the Akkadians, perhaps the Canaanites. Anyway, he's trying to show the successive empires as the statue did, and that's the timeline God's working on when it comes to the fullness of the Gentiles. Anyway, he's got it all wrong. And the only thing that really startled me was that it's all contingent on the rapture. So that's why this guy's got it all screwed up. Now, the jalapenos would like this book. I know that. Even though the fullness of the Gentiles and the rapture of the church will occur at the same time, we ourselves do not believe that they are one and the same thing. The fullness will be when Gentile power reaches its ultimate zenith under the reign of the Antichrist. And Israel's blindness will be removed during the time of Jacob's trouble, the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. Whew. Don't read that one, you'll get in a lot of trouble. Noah Hutchings wrote that. He's died in 2015, the former president of Southwest Radio Church Ministries in Oklahoma City. His main focus is Bible prophecy and end-time theories. He engaged in many extra-biblical predictions and date settings, all of which have been proven wrong. In 1974, he co-authored a book, suggested that the rapture would take place in 87 or 88. In 1978, the Christ's return and the establishment of the millennial kingdom would happen in 1989. In 1979, the tribulation will begin in 1981. Christ will return in 1988. And then 7 years from 81 to 88 will be the tribulation period. And then he wrote in 1984 in a magazine called The Gospel Truth, he said that Pope John Paul II was the Antichrist spoken of the Bible. So that's another reason not to listen or read this guy's works. He's got it all wrong. And of course, every failed prediction compounds foolishness and ignorance. Y2K fears, of course, he was, does Y2K equal 666? He wrote a book on that. The 2000, year 2000 computer bug has apocalyptic overtones. So just from this guy's list alone, I myself have survived 6 or 7 end of the world scenarios. And I'm sure you older guys much more than that. Hutchins has also frequently commented on his belief that giants walk the earth, the sunken city of Atlantis is real, UFOs are to be taken seriously, the world was subject to the biblical flood, Egyptian pyramids survived the biblical flood, essentially intact. The universe is 6,000 years old. Dinosaurs walk the earth with humans, and evolution is false. I'm not saying all of those are falsehoods. Okay, I think dinosaurs really existed, unless it's this awesome secret people have been keeping for years. UFOs, the flood, universe being 6 grand, Atlantis, giants. They will list these things to make the guy sound wacky, but the thing is, if you do enough research, some of these things come to light, and they're not as anti-biblical or crazy as they sound. So I'm not going to go into what I think on all those. UFOs gets a little weird to me. Everybody believes in them, but nobody's ever seen them. Of course, that applies to Bigfoot, maybe Satan too, I don't know. Cryptids, Mothman. Okay, so like I discussed last week, there are a few. Now, this Noah Hutchings is easy to put away. Once he mentioned the rapture, I knew his book was garbage. Okay? And that's why he gets Romans 11 so mixed up. But from our own kingdom ministry, there are people that teach this. Wrong. Like we discussed, people are able to identify true Israel properly. Right? And these are our teachers. I have a book here. I ran some copies off some pages. I'm not going to tell you who the teacher is because the guy's still alive, and I don't want to pick fights. I'm not picking fights. I just want to read something. If you find out, fine. With your own gumshoe, detective work. So we're at salvation and reconciliation. And he says, for if we, and he's going to quote Romans 5. Now, this is a kingdom teacher. Several degrees. For if we Israelites were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only this, but we also exult in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation. And then he's going to quote Romans 11 that we just read. Now, there are a few references of Scripture that seem to indicate salvation is inclusive of all other races of people. For those with a universal mindset who believe that all races are equal. You see what he's done? He's saying that other races of the earth, who we can observe as serving Jesus and naming him as king, right? Other races, he's saying that that doesn't happen. If you think it happens, then by extension, you believe all races are equal. You see, that's an inappropriate argument. That's unfair to do. I do not think or hold or contend with what I read in this Bible that all races are equal. They're not. They're not. God chose for himself a specific race, did he not? By definition, that makes God himself a racist, choosing one over the other. But I'm not saying all races are equal. I'm saying that if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is king, you could be saved, right? Okay. But, and he says that what I would do in that is I would grab a few isolated verses in order to prove my point. I don't have to do that. A few isolated verses isn't going to do the job. Cover to cover, the book puts that away for us. You just have to know it. But it's like I was talking to my mom about this, and she said, well, there's a nice black lady named, we'll call her Linda, that comes in her office, and she says, let me tell you what Jesus has done for me today and how he's blessed my life. Now, if my mom believed like this, she could say, well, Jesus doesn't talk to you, you're black. Your lifetime of service to him means nothing at the end of the age because, well, let's keep reading. Why? The other Adamic people would be included in salvation makes sense when the other biblical premises have been considered. An Adamic person is under law, is a sinner, and is in need of a remedy for his transgression. Other races are not under the law and are therefore not accounted for as sinners and are not in need for a remedy of sin, right? So you see, he's getting sneaky. So what they say is the law was only given to Israel at the base of Mount Horeb, right? Because the law was bestowed upon Israel, it is only Israel who's capable of sin, and therefore it is only Israel who is in the need of salvation. The other races who do not have the law are not sinners, therefore they don't need salvation. The first thing that springs into my head is, what are the wages of sin? Death, right? So if the other races don't sin, there shouldn't be any other races dying. But they do. We observe that today, all the time. If I was going to try to box myself in with that, I would then quote, I would see what happens to the animals, because animals die, but they don't sin. But anyway. And then, of course, if the other races can't sin and they don't need salvation, then God murdered all the Canaanites. Didn't he? That was straight murder. But how are the Canaanites, who are not under the law, guilty of sin enough to die for it? This would be apostasy, right? God said he abhorred those Canaanites, did he not? I don't know. Salvation from God, here's the summary. Salvation, this is an Israel-only message. Salvation from God is primarily for Israelites and then for other Adamic people. Other races may gain some benefits from the God of Israel as they submit to the rule of righteous Israel, but they are not the subjects of salvation through Jesus Christ. Israel only. Now, I know it doesn't sit well with most everybody I read that to. There's a clique or two in the nation that adheres to this. And after meeting them and talking to them and stuff, you start to kind of understand the kind of people this message appeals to. I don't hang out with those people. That's just me. Because it slimes its way into other areas of their lives, and they're not pleasant people. So anyway, but those statements simply aren't correct. They're not. I'm not saying that because of any personal bias or opinions I may or may not have, but because the Bible it simply doesn't teach that. The Bible just doesn't teach that. In order to get along with what we just read, in order to go with that, you're You're not going to be able, if you're going to go along with what we just read, then you've got to hang up a little thing called reality. That's all. God's word teaches one law for all the land. That's what it teaches. All right? So let's go to Exodus 12 and find out. Exodus 12:49. Exodus 12:49, I read, "One law shall be to him that is a homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourneth among you." I've done my homework for you. That word stranger comes from Strong's Hebrew number 1616. Actually, I have that here. I'll read that to you. Ger, a guest, by implication a foreigner, alien, sojourner. So, okay, now that we have that, I'm going to keep going. So, the law for both the Israelite and the stranger, 1616. So, just so we're all on the same page, Exodus 12 is about the Passover. Verses 1 through 20 is God's instruction on how they were to keep it. Verses 21 through 28 are additional instructions, and we see that the Israelites obeyed those. Verses 29 through 42 is the story of the Passover, the events that transpired in Egypt, right? Now, we'll read verse 43. "And the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. There shall be no stranger eat thereof," 1616. "But every man's servant that is bought for money, when thou hast circumcised him, then he shall eat thereof. A foreigner and an hired servant shall not eat thereof. And in one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry forth aught of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall you break a bone thereof." Break a bone thereof of the sacrifices, of course, prophetic. If you remember what David wrote about Christ, that he was able to count all of his bones. Remember? There's a prophecy right there about Christ's sacrifice in the middle of the second book of the law. Interesting. "All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all the males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as one that is born in the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof." And then we get to the law we were just read. Now, notice that circumcision here is referred to as both the Israelites and strangers are to do it. Strangers, 1616. Recall that, of course, is replaced by baptism as a token or sign of the covenant. All right, we've gone over that. And that would be covenant righteousness, which is law related. Okay. And we saw in verse 49, one law for all the inhabitants, permanent inhabitants or otherwise. Right? So it's sojourner, somebody's just passing through. He's camping out. He's on a bivouac. Right? So let's go to Leviticus 24. We only need 2 witnesses. We're going to pull 3. We'll not get to the third one today. Go to Leviticus 22. I'm sorry, Leviticus 24. Look at verse 22. "Ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger," 1616 again, "and as for one of your own country, for I am the Lord your God." So there again, one law for all the land. And we're going to have to figure out what's going on here. Nearly the exact same thing we read from Exodus, is it not? One manner of law for you, Israelites, and for the stranger. Now, this book I just read said there are no other people other than Israelites under the law. Well, here, God's making accommodations for this. Why? Somebody's a liar. Moses or that guy. So let's take verse 22 and put this in context of the whole chapter. Start at verse 10. "And the son of an Israelitish woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel. And this son of the Israelitish woman and a man of Israel strove together in the camp. And the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. And they brought him unto Moses, and his mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. And they put him in ward that the mind of the Lord might be showed them." Right? This is one of the only biblical cases of what we would call a jail. They put him in ward. Jails are not biblical. However, here he's held in ward until the elders come down and deliberate what to do with the guy. Okay? So jails, prisons, penitentiaries are not biblical. Penitence came from the Quakers. If a man sat quiet enough in a room long enough, he'd be Christian. That's what the Quakers believe. The friends? Okay, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Bring forth him that cursed without the camp, and let all that heard him lay their hands upon his head, and let all the congregation stone him. Notice, this is a death penalty offense, blasphemy always is, and there were several witnesses. You see, we do have the whole camp heard the guy do this. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, Whosoever curseth his God shall bear his sin, and he that blasphemeth the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall surely stone him, as well as the stranger, 1616, as he that is born in the land, when he blasphemeth the name of the Lord, shall be put to death. Okay, so the youth, or this young man, the reason I say youth or young man is because he's always attached to his mother. So if he'd have been I don't know what youth, he didn't go to juvenile hall, but I would assume he's a younger person because of the attachment to his mother, and you'll find that a lot in the Bible. So he was caught blaspheming God's name and was put to death for it by witnesses. Verse 10 mentioned that his mother was a pedigreed Israelite from the tribe of Dan, right? And that his father was an Egyptian. So the question now is, was the guy a full-blooded Israelite or a half-breed due to his Egyptian father? Right? Were the Egyptians related to us by blood? And if so, does that make the mixed multitude a group of people with either different genealogies or different religions or both? Right? That's the question. Because you see, if we can't get this mixed multitude straight, then we're going to be in trouble, and we're going to get into some Israel-only stuff, which won't hold water throughout the Bible. So, let's go to 1916, Archaeology in the Bible. I've done all my homework for you guys today. A whole week's worth of reading books. Let's see, page 24, I read. Let's see, second period of 13th dynasty of Egypt. He calls them Hyksos, which have been held to mean shepherd kings. 24. Okay, page 24. The invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos. This took many Semites to Egypt. The very name Hyksos is held to mean rulers of countries. It was probably a title which the kings called themselves, for they evidently ruled a considerable portion of Western Asia Minor as well as Egypt. Okay, if the Hyksos were Amorites, kinsmen of theirs had ruled in Babylonia long before their invasion of Egypt. And these may have been Amorites as indicated by the name Jacob which was born by one of their kings. This is the Egyptian form of the Babylonian Jacob an Amorite name found on business documents in Babylonia 300 or 400 years earlier. Stay with me. It's been held by many that Abraham, Joseph, and Jacob all went to Egypt during the reign of the Hyksos dynasty. It would be natural for Semites to enter such a country if they were ruled by a dynasty of the same blood as themselves. Right? It would be very difficult for Moses to blend in, and Jacob, as an Israelite and an Egyptian, except they looked the same. Right? Now, I'm not saying Egyptians were Christian Israelites. Obviously, they weren't. They worship Set and Isis. But here, same blood as themselves. Okay, let me see what these Hyksos people are. Let's see. Hyksos, which has been held to mean shepherd kings from the north. Shepherd kings from the north, which probably meant the ruler of countries. They have generally believed to be Semitic, though some scholars now think they may have been of Hurrian origin. In any event, large numbers of Semites came to Egypt with them and left many Semitic names in the deltas. Right? Starting to get an idea, right? 1916. All right, so we have Hyksos, group of people, and Amorites. I have a graph here of Ham's genealogy, son of Noah. You'll see here Canaan, Amorite, Hivite. Okay, so here's Noah's right up top here, and then on's Noah, right? Adam, Noah, Ham, Shem, Japheth. You guys know these guys, they're brothers. Apparently one of Ham's sons is Canaan. And then a few down, we've got Amorite, which we just read about. And then Hivites. We'll cover those guys in just a second. So, we have the other people, these called Hurrians or Hurry, Hurri, Hurries. Now, and of course, Semitic here refers to an ancient language found among ancient peoples located in the ancient Near East or Mesopotamia. Because when you hear Semitic, don't think race so much as this is a language. Okay, so that's going to help you out, really, big time. All right, now we mentioned the Hurrians. If you go to Sir Frederick Kenyon's work of 1949, The Bible in Archaeology, we'll read about these Hurrians, page 146. I read, 2 other American excavations, okay. The name of the Horites is barely known to the Old Testament, for brief mentions in Genesis and Deuteronomy, and even less is known, but it is now believed that the name Hivite, which occurs repeatedly in the catalog of peoples whom the children of Israel should drive out, is generally, if not always, a mere scribal error for Horite. The Horites are no doubt to be identified with the Hurri, who appear in Egyptian records and recently have also made their appearance in documents in an excavation known as Ras Shamra. Okay, and I'll read about Ras Shamra real quick. So to do all this so you don't have to. Ras Shamra is northwest of Syria. In its lowest levels of pottery has been found. The highest standard is the form of the position of the town, harbors, Mesopotamia, influences from every direction, okay? And one of the interests of the site is a trace of the varying balance of its associations with Babylonia and Egypt and with the islands of Greece and the Levant. All right? Building a case here. In the earliest ages, the connection is mainly with Mesopotamia. So whoever these Hurri are, we found traces of influence from Babylon all the way to Egypt, and then of course over there in the Aegean and the Levant. That'd be like Crete, right? Okay, the ethnic character of the earliest occupants of the site and its ancient name do not seem to be determined, but in the latter part of the 3rd millennium, it seems to have been involved in the Amorite and Canaanite invasion from the south that eventually reached Babylon. Okay, so here's these people again. Certainly, we reach the period of records where it is occupied by Semitic people of the Amorite Canaanite class, and its name is then revealed to us as Ugarit. By the name, it is mentioned in a letter of Hammurabi, and thenceforth references it to occur in the records of Babylonia, of the Hittite kings, of Egypt, and other letters. What happened at Ugarit during the time of the Hyksos domination in Egypt is uncertain. There was change in the character of the pottery, as it suggested that the Hurri, or Horites, who were located in the northern Syria, occupied the town and built a great earthen rampart around it. The Horites were akin to Mitannians, and their influence in Ugarit is shown in the presence there of Horite Sumerian dictionaries. Thus, this period which follows, chief interest for the Bible student, because the period of the Israelites were entering Palestine on the south and beginning to establish themselves among Canaanites. So we're following these people around who were kinsmen of the Ugartics. Kinsmen of the Ugartics, who were the Hurrites and all this, right? The literature of Ras Shamra shows a strong light on the conditions which the Israelites found themselves when they settled in Canaan, and deserves to be described at some length. So, and they get into cuneiform tablets, and the tablets show that there is a connection between Egyptian hieroglyphs, Babylonian cuneiform, Hittite languages, described as Proto-Phoenician or Canaanite. Round and round we go. Besides Sumerian, Hurrian, and Babylonian texts, the alphabetic Canaanite writings, and the unknown language of the dictionary, there are hieroglyphs on monuments from Egypt, Hittite characters on seals, and silver vessels, a striking illustration of the variety of languages to be found in a commercial port of the general multifarious use of writing in the 15th century BC. But by far, they have religious texts. And they say here that, it mentions the religious text of Sumer. To pass to the text in a series of mythological stories shows us what the Canaanite religion was. The supreme god is El. a name familiar in the Old Testament. He goes on and on and on about how the Canaanite influences of religion are found throughout the other ancient religions, and that the languages are the same, right? Now, we watch a lot of the archaeological videos here at church. I do a lot of my own, and we watch the Tim Mahoney's Patterns of Evidence series, right? It's very frustrating. If you go to the Moses controversy, he's trying to get to the bottom of what Moses was, how he wrote the Hebrew and where it came from. Every single one of his films are excellent. They're excellent. However, when you get down to whether or not these people were very intelligent Adamites, you always hit a brick wall. It's either because they won't let them dig there, or that shows ethnic bias. You know, that we have the alphabet and things because of God's builder race. Every time they were going to get to that conclusion, it's always stopped dead. And then you'll have a rabbi go on and tell us how wrong we are about that assumption, right? But you're going to see this morning. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, but the stuff they leave out of the documentaries is all right here. My grandma said the Bible is the greatest history book of all time. So all you have to do is take a few archaeological evidence, dig sites, a few history books, connect the dots. Now, the reason why we do this isn't because our foundation of Christianity lies on where Mount Sinai actually it is. It doesn't. It'd be nice to find it. It'd be pretty cool to see it. But fulfilled Bible prophecy makes this book real. Christ in his spirit to us and how he communicates to us and blesses us, keeps us from harm, that makes it real. Not some dig site. It's interesting that it connects the dots. So we mentioned the Hurrians, Rosh Hashanah. Now, here, ancient Semitic speaking peoples. This is where it's all going to come around for you. Speakers of East Semitic include the Akkadian Empire, Assyria, Babylonia, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews, and Arameans. All the same language. Semitic peoples, right? Don't think Semitism or Jewish. We're not there. We're trying to find out Akkadian Empire, Assyria, Babylonia, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews, or Arameans. You follow these things around, you're going to come to the same exact builder race doing the same exact stuff. Even the guys that built the Tower of Babel knew what they were doing. Could have only been the builder race, right? Could have non-believers. Or maybe they were believers. We'll get into that in a minute. So anyway, there's this Semitic speaking. So we're going to follow that language. It's very important. And then, of course, we're going to come to a guy called the Horites. The Bible only mentions Seir. Seir the Horite. Okay, and not a lot of things are known about him except his daughter and who she married. She married Esau's son Eliphaz. And, of course, Seir the Horite, the Horites were kicked out of Esau, Edom's land, and were never heard from again. So we know that about Seir, Mount Seir, the mountain range. Okay. So, what do we have here? Bring it all around. Going through a lot. Hurrians. Hurrians were a people who inhabited the ancient Near East during the Bronze Age. They spoke the Hurrian language and lived throughout northern Syria, upper Mesopotamia, and southeastern Anatolia. Keep that word Anatolia in mind. The Hurrians were first documented in the city of Urkesh, where they built their first kingdom. The largest, most influential Hurrian kingdom was Mitanni. The population of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia included a large population of Hurrians, and there was significant Hurrian influence in Hittite mythology. And by the early Bronze Age, the Hurrians had been assimilated in with other peoples. Okay? All right? Horites. The Horites initially appear in the Bible as being members of the Canaanite coalition who lived near Sodom and Gomorrah. The coalition rebelled against Chedorlaomer of Elam. Remember the Elamites? Who ruled them for 12 years. That's in Genesis. Later, according to Genesis 36, the Horites coexisted and intermarried with the family of Esau. Okay, we just saw that. Remember, because that's the Dukes of Edom. That's them. He's said to be a descendant of Hor, who has supposedly lived around the time of Ru, who is a descendant of Hivi, a son of Canaan, son of Ham. Still there. Okay, they also linked, the pre-Edomite Horite chiefs, descendants of Seir, are listed in the books of Genesis and Chronicles. Two of the chiefs would appear to have been the female Timnah. Timnah is infamous for being the progenitor of the Amalekites. the arch enemy of the Israelites. I like arch enemy, kind of makes us out to be the heroes. But anyway, and then the chiefs or dukes are listed, of Esau are listed in Genesis, okay? So that's the Horites. Stay with me. We mentioned Hittites. Hittites were an Anatolian people who played an important role in establishing the first kingdom in Kanesh. And the Levant, they were known to be living in, included most of Anatolia, parts of northern Levant, and upper Mesopotamia. So you see we're staying right in there. Okay. Hyksos, or rulers of foreign lands, or shepherd lands, is a term in which modern Egyptology designates the kings of the 15th dynasty of Egypt. Don't quote me on the dates of the dynasties because they move around. Hyksos may have been preceded by two groups of Canaanite people who eventually settled in the delta of the Nile during the 12th dynasty onwards, who may have succeeded the crumbling and unstable Egyptian control at some point during the 13th dynasty. Now we're in 2000 BC. 2000 to 1500 BC, right? Okay. The Hyksos period marks the first in which Egypt was ruled by foreign rulers. Many details of the rules, such as the true extent of the kingdom and even the names and the order of the kings, remains uncertain. The Hyksos practiced many Levantine or Canaanite customs, as well as many Egyptian customs. They have been credited with introducing several technological innovations to ancient Egypt, such as the horse and chariot, the sickle sword, and composite bow. These guys, right? The Anatolian peoples, we keep throwing that word Anatolian. The Anatolians were Indo-Europeans speaking peoples, Indo-European speaking peoples of the Anatolian Peninsula in present-day Turkey, identified by their use of the Anatolian languages. These people were among the oldest Indo-European ethno-linguistic groups, of the most archaic. Because Anatolians were among the first Indo-European peoples to separate from Proto-Indo-European community, they gave origin to the individual Indo-European peoples. Stay with me. The Anatolian peoples constituted the first known waves of Indo-European immigrants out of the Eurasian steppe. It is likely they reached Anatolia via the Balkans or the Caucasus. Now, this is just me. I'm an amateur archaeologist. I'm just going through this. Although they had wagons, they probably integrated before. Then they had learned to use chariots of war. If you follow the chariots around, you eventually come to the barbarians, right? Anyway, I'm sorry, not chariots. Horseback warfare. Subgroups include seceded, they have a common route out of the Anatolian region. Common route. The Anatolian people were intruders in an area which local population had already founded cities, established literate bureaucracies, and established kingdoms and palaces. They entered the region, the cultures, and the local populations were significantly influenced by them linguistically, politically, and religiously. Right? So these guys would muscle in. List of Anatolian peoples. See if you recognize a few of these. Okay, here's the languages they spoke. Albanian, Balto-Slavic, Celtic, Germanic, Hellenic, Greek, Indo-Aryan languages, Italic, Romance language, Anatolian, Indo-Hittite, Italo-Celtic, right? Proto-Anatolian, Proto-Germanic languages, Proto-Norse languages, Proto-Italic languages, Proto-Celtic, Proto-Greek. Their writings are found with these languages, Hittite texts, hieroglyphics, Homer's The Odyssey and Iliad, the Homeric epics, languages spoke in Gaul, right, an ancient name, Latin, Gothic, Old Irish glosses, which we know as Old Gaelic. All right? So the list of Anatolian peoples is here. Hittites, Cappadocians, Catatonians, Danuna, ancient Egyptians known as the Sea Peoples, Philistines, Trojans, right? So what in the heck is going on here? Because I didn't find this out from any of the Egyptologists or anything like that, because every time they get into this, they hit a brick wall and they're like, it cannot be the Caucasian peoples blessing the world. It cannot be Genesis 12:3. It can't be that. It's got to be these other little heathens, the noble Indian and everybody else, that blesses us. Every time they get so close to saying, well, it's the people that came over those mountains with the Bible in their hands. There was the Dark Ages, I know, but still, here we are today. So here is a map. They show you the map and the migrations of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Okay, and I know this is small for you guys, but I say the black is where the Anatolian language moved around. Remember those languages? And look, you'll see Proto-Italy, Proto-Germany, right? On out. There's some Russians, Slavics. Remember, we have all that. Let's see, the dark blue and blue, the Indo-European speakers. Look where they're going. Purple, Indo-Aryans. These guys went all over the place. Rudyard Kipling ended up down there, right? It was a long time ago. And yellow is the Greeks, right? They moved around. Now, you should know this map fairly well. You've seen this map before. I've shown it to you, right? You guys know that map? Okay. Well, just in case. I happen to have a big one of those. There's your migration of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, right? We all know this. Now pay attention. Look where they're going. Celts. We got Iberia here. Hebrew, right? Saxons, Isaacsons, right? Okay, there it is. That's what we just looked at. Now this map is the migration of the Proto-Indo-Europeans who had a Semitic language that gave root to the rest of our common languages, Gothic, Gaulish, Gaelic, which is, if you can read Gaelic, you can almost read Hebrew, and vice versa. Now, how that happened, but now the archaeologist confounds them. We just did this with a little bit of Wikipedia and a few books I have in the library, right? Okay, so there's that. Now, this is all heresy, because we even watched the video this morning, and they're like, well, where the real Mount Sinai is, we can't get there because the government shuts us down. Because if they can prove where the real Mount Sinai is, right in the middle of Islam, guess what that makes Islam? Pagan. They're not going to stand for that, right? Now, you read about the languages and stuff. Here's the Odyssey. Homer, right? The epic poem about Odysseus after coming home for the Trojan War. So we get a word Odyssey, a long journey. Usually a long journey home. Anyway, he's seeing the spirits of the dead. Okay, and Achilles comes to him. Achilles says, and I saw where Telephus fell, and how many of his Hittite men-at-arms were slaughtered at his side. Then again, we Argive captains took our place on the wooden horse, and rode and rested solely with me to throw an ambush and open it. And on the other side, the Danaan chiefs and officers. Danaan chiefs. If you go into who King Priam was in the Iliad, you'll find out that he's a Dardanian. And if you look at the bloodline of Christ, King Darda is right there. Right? Not saying this is all fact, but here's local heroes from the same area that these people came out of. They're amazing stories, almost like heroes. Legends. Amazing. One of my favorite books of all time. Actually, it made the top 3. Top 2, of course, there's the Iliad. You read all this all through, you'll find all this stuff. This is our stuff. Proto-Indo-Europeans, maybe, if you want to call them that. But this is Israelite literature, maybe. Is it? Same language. Anyway, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll find things that is startling. In Judges 14, here's a famous verse from Judges 14. Let me propound a riddle to you. If you can give me the right answer during the 7 days of the feast, I shall give you 30 linen tunics, 30 sets of clothing. But if you're not able to tell it to me, you must give me 30 linen tunics and 30 sets of clothing. Who said that? Samson, that's his riddle, right? Have the hunter something sweet, right? What is sweeter than honey? You know, right? Okay, and the guy, and look at this, Samson, that's a lot of money right there. In the Iliad, Patroclus, he has 12 beauteous robes and 12 cloaks of a single fold, has as many coverlets and many white mantles, therewithal as many tunics. And these are going on to a bet, right? Just a few things, you know. So if you look here, the Philistines, 1 Samuel, the Philistines were stationed on one hill, and Israel was stationed on the opposite hill. You know this one, right? Ravine was between them. A champion of the Philistine forces stepped forward. Who is he? Goliath of Gath. He stopped and called out to the ranks of Israel, and he said to them, "Why should you come out and engage in battle? I am a Philistine, and you are Saul's servants. Choose one of your men and let him come down against me. If he bests me in combat and kills me, we will become your slaves. But if I best him and kill him, you shall become our slaves and serve us." And the Philistine ended, "I herewith defy the ranks of Israel. Get me a man and let's fight it out." Isn't that what it? That's Goliath haranguing the Israelite troops, right? The Iliad. Paris, if thou wilt have me war and do battle, make the other Trojans to sit down, and the Achaeans, Greeks, but ye sit in the midst of King Menelaus, dear to Ares, to do battle for Helen and all her possessions. And whosoever of us twain shall win, and prove him the better man, let him duly take all the wealth and the woman, and bear them home. Hector, in hope that he may challenge some of the Danaans, Dan, in a single fight to do battle with him, man to man in dread combat, so shall the bronze-grieved Achaeans have indignation and rouse someone to do battle in single combat against goodly Hector. Make the Trojans to sit down and all the Achaeans, and do thou challenge whoso is best of the Achaeans to do battle with thee man to man in dread combat. Where in the world did the Trojans and the Greeks get these ideas? Right? Goliath is described as wearing armor. According to 1 Samuel, he had a bronze helmet on his head, wore a breastplate of scale armor, a bronze breastplate weighing 5,000 shekels. He had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung on his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's bar, and the iron head of his spear weighed 600 shekels. Right? Then you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, just our other people's stories. The greaves, first Achilles set upon his legs, and in his hand he held a spear of 11 cubits. Odysseus carried a helmet and 2 spears. Elsewhere, I had put on my glorious armor, and he grabbed in my hand 2 long spears, and he took 2 mighty spears tipped with bronze. The same people, the same writing, because these people read their Bibles too. These are legends, right? Now, you know, Goliath's sword, he decapitated Goliath with his own sword, took the head of the Philistine and brought to Jerusalem and put his weapons in his own tent. Isn't that what David did? Right? And then King Saul, remember, he got slain in Gilboa. Right? Was it Gilboa? Yeah. And they cut off his head, stripped his armor, and put it up in one of their temples. The Philistines did, right? Well, now Hector, when he had stripped from Patroclus his glorious armor, sought to hale him away that he might cut the head off of his shoulders with a sharp bronze and drag off the corpse and give it to the dogs of Troy. And Ananias held Imbrius on high, stripped him of his armor, and the head did the son of Olias, cut from the tender neck, being wroth for the slaying of Amphimachus, and with a swing he set it rolling through the throng like a ball. The same Israelites. How can you not see? Goliath's armor and weapons are highly characteristic not only of the Aegean world, but of the areas that were settled by other sea peoples. Excavations at the early Iron Age cemetery uncover a tomb of a warrior buried with a helmet, greaves, shield, and a spear that were strikingly similar to the descriptions of the armor of both the Philistine champion Goliath and the Homeric heroes. Right? Similar greaves were unearthed in Cyprus, dating from the same era, as well as somewhat later sites in Sardinia. This type of spear had not been seen in Israel and had no name in Hebrew. Samuel describes it as a weaver's beam. It is a leash rod of a loom. This is a block of wood which separates the threads of the warp to offer passage for the threads of the weft. Its characteristic feature was the loops or leashes of a cord tied to it. Remember? Goliath's spear. A typical Greek javelin, which we just read about, has a loop and a cord wound around the shaft so that the weapon could be hurled at a greater distance with greater stability by virtue of the spin. The Greeks and Romans called such a javelin the loop. However, a well-known artifact demonstrates that this new foreign weapon was characteristic of the Bronze Greek age, and a warrior vase was uncovered. This is an exceedingly important find, which dates to the mid-12th century BCE, 12th century, 1200s, right? Mycenaean warriors marching in single file, carrying long spears, wearing greaves, bronze helmets, and coats of mail similar not only to those which Goliath is described as wearing, but to the images of the other related sea peoples. What is particularly noteworthy about the long spears of these Mycenaean warriors is they all have a strange bulbous object jutting from the shaft. These unusual appendages are the earliest visual representations of the uniquely Aegean throwing loop. Just as we read about in the Bible, despite this evidence, the claim that the Philistines and other sea peoples actually came from the Aegean world remains controversial. Some have posited that they were socio-economic rather than ethnic phenomenon. See? Cannot be the same people, the same ethnicity. It cannot be. A loose confederation of sea merchants operating out of Cyprus. Let's see. Numerous expressions in weaponry, armor, fighting techniques, and even religious beliefs are mentioned in the biblical record as being unique to the Philistines, having known literary, artistic, and archaeological parallels only in the Homeric writings and in what physical evidence remains to us of the sea peoples. Immaterial of how the controversy over the origin of these seaborne invaders comes to be settled, the extraordinary parallels between Homer's epics and the biblical descriptions of the Philistines clearly demonstrate a degree of contrast between the Aegean world and the biblical authors. You see, now here's an article. The guy goes through multiple pages of comparing Homeric Odyssey and Iliad to what he read all about in the Bible. And as far as he's concerned, well, he wasn't going to say it, I will. As far as I'm concerned, those are the same people. Right? Now, remember we looked at our Israel migrations? Okay, and we saw where they were going. Idols of the King, 1859. The Holy Grail. The cup itself, from which our Lord drank at the last sad supper with his own, this from the blessed land of Arimathea. That Joseph, to whom the monk from our old books I know, that Joseph came of old to Glastonbury, gave him an isle of the marsh whereon to build. Here's the English people writing about this stuff. Where'd they get that idea? King Arthur, Le Morte Arthur, 1485, first published. King Arthur's running into the dictator of Rome. Rome has come to Britain, and they've demanded that Arthur surrender to Rome's rule and give him back pay in the terms of back taxes. Okay? Arthur says this. Then answered King Anguish of Scotland, Sir, ye ought of right to be above all other kings, for unto you is none like in Christendom, or of knighthood, nor of dignity. I counsel you never to obey the Romans, for when they reigned on us, they distressed our elders, and put this land to great extortions and tallies. And these men pledge against Rome and join King Arthur. Then King Arthur sends all these wise men, and this is where he says, now I know these may be legends. King Arthur says, and forthwith he sent his wise old knights unto the following countries: Alexandria, India, Armenia, whereas the river of Euphrates runneth into Asia, to Africa, Europe, Arabia, Egypt, Damascus, Cappadocia, Tarsus, Turkey, Pontus, Pamphylia, Syria, Galatia, Macedonia, Greece, Cyprus, and Portugal, where all the Spaniards live. Yet another record of these people writing about these same things. And here, Lancelot saves Elaine from a boiling tub. If you guys read any of this, you know where I'm at? Anyway, Lancelot says, Sir, if it please you, will you go to the nearby chapel that we may give loving and thanking unto God? Sir Knight, you delivered this lady. Then Sir Lancelot took his shield and went with them. Whereall came King Pelles, a good and noble king, and saluted Sir Lancelot. And he said, My name is King Pelles, king of this country, and cousin nigh unto Joseph of Arimathea. 1485. Right? Glastonbury, Joseph of Arimathea. Going to a more modern retelling of that. Sorry, my books fell. Going to a more modern retelling of that, and the once and future king will read the same thing. And then he saved the lady from the boiling tub. Then King Pelles limps down from the castle on the other side of the valley to find out what all the excitement was about. He looked at Lancelot's shield, kissed the child absent-mindedly, and said, Dear me, you are Sir Lancelot, and you fetched my daughter out of that kettle arrangement. How kind of you. It was prophesied long ago. I am King Pelles, near cousin to Joseph of Arimathea, and you, of course, are but the 8th degree from our Lord Jesus Christ. Good gracious, said Lancelot. Indeed, indeed, said King Pelles. It is all written down in the stones at Stonehenge. English legends, right? All the same thing. All the same peoples. Almost a little micro heirs to the promise we have here. But very simply, I just read a few books I happen to know. Those are my favorite books of all time, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Once a Future King. You read that as a kingdom believer, and then you've really got the key. You're like, oh, well, these are our own people we're reading about. Legendary people, of course. But everybody likes heroes and villain stories anyway. And of course, when you think about Homer or Zeus or Achilles, the guys that pop into your head are the Greeks, white guys. Never seen a black Zeus. Never read an African epic poem either. Or seen the African aqueducts. Now, there are books, and why is this all hidden? There are books like this here, textbook here. That's Ancient Civilizations. I took Western Civilizations in college. I got myself into some trouble in that class. But anyway, here they say that they cover it up. So let's see, where was I at? Glyphs and symbols, King Tut, King Ramses, hieroglyphics. So here they're saying that the names of the kings are translating to Hebrew for the word lotus and stuff. The Hebrew and the hieroglyphics of the king lists are corresponding, right? That's weird. Let's see. The crucial part of the Mesopotamian here. In most years, such floods were entirely beneficial, Nile Delta, to land would otherwise have been baked dry. They were never entirely predictable, less so, for example, than those of the Nile, whose rivers filtered through great lakes on their way to Egypt. There was no such natural reservoirs to moderate the flow of the Tigris or Euphrates, which in years of heavy rainfall could swamp entire regions of southern Mesopotamia, wiping out livestock and drowning whole villages. Memories of terrible deluges fed through legend eventually influenced the biblical tale of Noah. So that's a legend. But it's interesting here that kind of puts a little more Well, weight behind the localized flood thing, if you think about that was a legendary thing. You read about the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? You guys know that? Sumer, Babylonian legends. Anyway, he has a deluge in that too. Temples and ziggurats. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel almost certainly reflects travelers' tales of ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and more specifically, the great temple of Babylon, which rose 300 feet above the city. To the early Israelites, the great cosmopolitan city of Babylon, where many different languages were spoken, might well have seemed an image of confusion, leading Hebrew scribes to link the city's Akkadian name with the Hebrew. So you see here, the fact that the Tower of Babel may have been a real place is explained that because the early Israelites found it. So what they're saying here is the biblical story of the Tower of Babel is actually rooted in the cosmopolitan city here, which they borrowed that and then made a story of the Tower of Babel out of it. You see what I'm saying? And this is what this textbook does over and over and over again. But it does make some other similar distinctions that does help. So here, ghosts. This is interesting. Sumerians were firm believers in ghosts. Now their name for ghosts is pretty cool. Those whose towns are the ruins. So ghosts. They thought the dead people's spirits roam restlessly in their bodies if they were left unburied, or if they had no kin to provide them with food or drink during regular offerings. Those who had died violent deaths, who had offended the gods by breaking taboos, were particularly at risk for becoming ghosts. Malevolent ghosts could harm the living by seizing their minds or bodies, which they entered through the ear. Their victims would then be stricken down by disease. The only cure in such cases was to employ the services of an exorcist. Right? Now that's Sumerian religion. I'm reading about. And Belshazzar. Now they do throw the Bible a bone in this one, I do believe. But every time you read about something that in the ancient civilizations that would correlate with exactly what the Bible says, it's not that the Bible's true, it's that these people did this for sure, and the Bible borrowed from them. You see, that's the whole book. In college, it was the same thing. Every time I said, well, this is real, that's supposition, I got an F. But every time I said the professor was right and the Bible was wrong, A+. 100%. Very difficult. And I said, I did a report on, I was going to do Joan of Arc, and I actually did on why the fall of the Roman Empire. And the professor said, well, that's interesting. Why? Why did Rome fall? I was like, Caesar became Christian. She had never heard that before in her adult life. And here's some whippersnapper. And I'm like, well, of course it fell. Christianity took over. No, not to them. Okay, here's Belshazzar. Belshazzar's feasts cast an interesting concern on the Babylonian concern for, or an interesting sidelight on the Babylonian concern for omens and high regard, in which the high regard in which they held those who could read them. Right? You know that. Belshazzar, right? Writing on the wall. His knees knocked together, he's so scared. A ghostly hand writing a message on the wall during a state banquet, and sent for the Hebrew prophet Daniel to interpret it, offering to elevate him to the third rank of the kingdom in return for his expertise. The words transcribed in modern editions of the Bible as Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson, and are actually Babylonian weights. They were 60 tekels and 2 parson and 1 mina. Daniel interpreted this mysterious message as a sign of diminishing value. The later rulers of the empire measured against its founder, Nebuchadnezzar, which had been weighed in the balance and found wanting, right? And their realm would be divided and given to the Persians. This prophecy was duly fulfilled when Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, right? Now that right there, well, that actually helps the Bible. Then, if what Daniel said and the prophecy was fulfilled, well, that makes the Bible real, and they even give you the exact date it happened. That's the one part in it I said, well, they can't really do anything about that one in the Bible, and they don't. You see, notice they say, oh, no, that's just, mumbo jumbo. Anyway, we went a long way off track. Long way off track. Where were we? Let's see. I hope we learned a thing or two, right? Okay, so these Egyptians. We start on the Egyptians. Leviticus 24. Was this man a true-blooded Israelite, or was he a half-breed, half-Egyptian? Was he a half-blood? Well, from what we've studied, we could assume he would at least be Adamic. That's all the peoples we just read about. Now, I'm not saying believing Christians. I'm not saying that. Right? We had heathen Greeks. We had heathen Canaanites. Adamic peoples, the only people that could have had the alphabet, written languages, books, libraries, towers they built, on and on and on, all the way up to the legends of King Arthur and all the way back. Then you get into this country, you've got the same stuff happening. Chain of Christianity, follow it. That's what we're doing. But we have Adam. So when I say Adamites, you guys know. Adam. Okay, then we've got Abel, he's murdered. So the sons of Adam are Cain and Seth. I can safely say they are Adamic. Okay. Then we have Noah. He's Adamic, right? Shem, Ham, Japheth. They're Adamic, along with their progeny, provided no interracial relations occur, right? Okay. They would be kin to us Israelites then, right? Okay. Now what about Cain? What about the Canaanites and their families? Adamites, right? Esau is our brother. We know that for certain. And even the word states in Deuteronomy 23, do not abhor or hate an Edomite, for he is your brother, right? And you can't move that word around. That's brother, okay? The same verse also mentions Egyptians as well, interestingly. Don't abhor an Egyptian because you were once a stranger in their land. That's the last part of that verse. Anyway, so this guy in Leviticus 24 could have been either a full-blooded son of Jacob. However, he could have been a racial stranger as well, due to the foreign influences upon Egypt's later dynasties, right? The only thing that would help is this. The Septuagint, we'll read what it has to say. Okay, because we're going to have to get to the bottom of this. So I read the same thing we read, but I'm going to read just a little portion of it. Now there came out among the Israelites a son of an Israelitish woman, but his father was an Egyptian, right? So his father could have been definitely an Adamite, maybe, which would have made this guy a full-blooded Adamite at least, or a half-blood, if he wasn't an Adamite from the other Egyptian foreign invaders. And this son of the Israelite woman and the man who was an Israelite quarreled in the camp, and the son of the Israelitish woman, having named the name of God, cursed it, upon which they brought him before Moses. Now his mother's name was Salamith, and she was the daughter of Dabri of the tribe of Dan. Okay? And when they had committed him to custody, to pass sentence on him by the decree of the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, lead out him who cursed without the camp, and all who heard shall lay their hands on his head, and all the congregation shall stone him. Then speak to the children of Israel, and thou shalt say to them, be the man who he may, who shall curse God, he shall contract guilt, but let him who nameth the name of the Lord be put to death. Okay, I'm sorry, I read that. Then he spake to children, be the man who shall curse a god, little g, he shall contract guilt. Okay? But let him who nameth the name of the Lord be put to death. So there's a distinction there. Keep that in mind. Let the whole congregation of Israel stone him with stones, whether he be a proselyte or born among them. Proselyte changed. So, when we get into that, here in verse 16, we see the word strangers that we found in the King James has been termed proselyte, right? Why is that important? I go to this dictionary now. This is an old one. Dictionary of the Bible by Hastings, copyright 1902. All right, proselyte, here. A visitor, newcomer, is the usual rendering of ger. Ger was 1616, remember? Okay. Originally, one who takes up his residence in a foreign land and so puts himself under the protection of a foreign people as a client, particularly a foreigner thus residing in Palestine. Foreigner, right? And we just read all about the Palestinians, the Philistines, where all these people were from. All right. It is certain that if he was if he was a circumcised convert, he remains always a foreign resident. Right? Those who have changed, convert, proselyte. Those who have changed to the better order of Moses, because they have come to a new and God-pleasing constitution. A convert could be described as one who turned to Jehovah, swore by the name of Jehovah, prayed to him, sought and kept his law, especially the Sabbath and the prohibition of eating blood. Circumcision could not be omitted. Almost without exception, the supposition is that the converts will live in Israel's land. They are circumcised gerim. Proselytes are those who leave polytheism and adopt to the worship of the one true God. He describes him as changing to the better order, as migrating to piety, journeying to a good colony, deserting to God or to truth, wandering to truth, and to the honoring of the one who was worthy of honor, as fugitives to God and supplicants of those who changed the constitution their constitution to that of the Israelites. I changed the word Jews for you, so to those of the Jews, Judeans, Israelites, believing Israelites. According to Deuteronomy 23, full entrance in the assembly of the Lord was denied entirely to eunuchs, bastards, Ammonites, and Moabites. Ammonites and Moabites were the daughters of Lot, their sons, remember? While admittance was granted to children of the third generations in the case of the Edomite and the Egyptian, it is not clear how far the principle may have been applied in later times or just what the restrictions implied. Certainly, the Passover could be observed after circumcision was carried out. So what do we have here? This is what we're getting to the bottom of. So the Israel-only message is starting to fall apart now, because this word stranger is what you're going to try to box me in and say, look, Reed, stranger means that it's just a cousin of ours who doesn't live in the land, right? So if I said, well, there's no strangers here. So Israel-only people would say, look, Reed, what that means is somebody from Britain's visiting us, right? That's what stranger means. That's what that 1616 means. And they'll say, well, that just means sojourner, so he's going to go away one day, right? And they'll say, well, that's still a racial relation, common racial relation. He just doesn't live here. And that's what they'll try to do with it, with the Israel-only thing. But then the Septuagint throws a wrench in the works and says, well, wait a second, this is a proselyte. Well, what's that mean? Maybe a non-believing Israelite who now believes, right? Maybe a non-believing Adamite who now believes. Maybe a non-believing Egyptian who now believes, right? Could be anybody. Proselyte. Now, does that mean they get Jacob's covenants? No, it does not. No, not racial strangers. No, that's final. We talked about this before. That's breaking the contract. That makes God a liar. We can't do that. Compromises his infinite justness, right? Can't do that. Proselyte. There's the key, and we'll take apart this Israel only message next week because I'm going to be out of time. But God says of this youth, whether he's a full-blooded Israelite or a racial stranger, put him to death. Why? Because in spite of his lineage, it's one law for all the land. God's law. What land? The land God gave to his children as a contracted inheritance, right? Now we have to understand that that land is this land, and not by any bias of our own ethnicity, but by following fulfilled Bible prophecy and how it applies to us in this land today. That's it. So in an Israelite land where Israelites occupy and live, there's one law, God's law, and there's no difference in those who are to obey it. be they Israelite or non-Israelite. All right? So next week we'll continue, but I want to leave you with this thought. Do we in this land have Israelites and non-Israelites? Okay. Do we have strangers who are proselytes to Christianity and the gospel of the kingdom? Do we have perhaps people who are Adamic yet are still unbelievers, while some Adamites have converted to a belief in Christ, his kingdom, and his word? All observable realities, right? The Israel only is not an observable reality. It is not. It's certainly not Bible doctrine. Now, I know we didn't get all the way around with this 1616, because which we will next time. Now, the 1616 is the ger, right? And there is ger, and then I also understand the word stranger in other parts of the Bible and other parts of the Hebrew texts is zwar, which is indeed racial stranger. So the argument that was presented when I read the other kingdom teacher's book was, well, other races aren't under the law. Now I said, well, yes, they are, but then they're going to say, well, Reed, you're wrong, because that word stranger is from 1616, which doesn't mean racial stranger, it just means a traveler, right? So you've got me in a dead end, because now you're saying, see, the Israel-only message is correct, because law to stranger and law to homeborn is still only Israel, because there's no chance that 1616 is a racial stranger. Is there? There is, and I'll show you how you get around that next week. Now, for further reading, there have been people that have been asking and they've been calling and they've been interested in this. Further reading, I would highly suggest getting a hold of Ewing's study into the meaning of the word Gentile. It's just a little pamphlet. I sent some out this week. Excellent. This will straighten it out for you. Another good book, Mystery of the Gentiles by evangelist Ted Weiland. Good stuff. Good stuff. He's spot on a lot of it. You can even say I've got a bookmark in it. I've been reading it myself. Good stuff. Read this a few times. Primogenesis, Howard Rand. That's my cheat sheet. And in the back, you'll find all the maps and stuff. You guys recognize this, right? Primogenesis, where most of the charts I use today came out of. Primogenesis by Howard Rand is invaluable. I would suggest reading it a few times over the course of years. Jew and Non-Jew Israelites by Torgerson. Excellent book. Helps you straight out a few more things we were talking about this today, about the common peoples that were found in Mesopotamia. And then, of course, you want to get into Esther and the proselytes that converted forcefully. You know what I'm talking about? That'll help you out there, because that Jew word's going to change too. That'll be 2 Kings and things like that. Stephen Collins' works, there's 4 of them I particularly like. Book number 2, Israel's Lost Empires. It's everything we just studied today. And the origins and empire of ancient Israel, right? There, now these are going to start filling in the gaps. And you see there's Joseph and Ephraim and Manasseh. He's got his arms crossed. I know it, my son, I know it, but it must be thus. That's it. And then 1 through 6, I used 6 and 3, Biblical Antiquities by E. Raymond Capp. Awesome books, awesome books. There's a 6-volume series. We have all these books in the bookstore. We sell them. We have some for you guys to borrow. But yeah, Biblical Antiquities 1 through 6 is really good. It straightens out a lot of the things that we talked about today about the common beliefs of who the Egyptians are or aren't, and also excavations. He also wrote another book about the Assyrian tablets, the cuneiform tablets. That helps out a lot too. And he goes into the Rosetta Stone and all that stuff, and how the Rosetta Stone actually had Egyptian and Greek language on the same stone. Anyway, that's my further reading. Do some of that. I encourage you to do study on your own. See if you can prove me wrong. Encourage that. That's all we have for today. We'll close in prayer.